The pain of being invisible. Even to those closest to you. Stoic emotional freedom. Have you ever felt like you're there, but invisible? Like you're in a room full of people, maybe even surrounded by family, friends, or colleagues, and yet no one truly sees you? As if who you really are lives behind a fogged glass no one even tries to wipe clean. This is one of the most silent and piercing pains of human experience, the pain of never being truly seen. Not by strangers, but by those who should know you best. From a young age, we learn to seek recognition, a nod of approval from our parents, a compliment in school, a sign that we belong, that we matter. But what happens when we grow up and realize that even those closest to us still don't really see us? Not because we're absent, but because there's no real connection. And the most painful part is how this wound often wears a disguise, as anxiety, frustration, or a strange kind of loneliness that shows up even when we're not alone. Stoicism doesn't deny this pain, but it offers a radical shift in perspective. What if the real issue isn't that others don't see us, but that we keep hoping they will? What if emotional freedom begins the moment we stop depending on external validation? According to Epictetus, freedom starts when we stop clinging to what's outside our control, and how others see us, or fail to, is completely outside of our control. This video is a deep dive into that invisible wound. We'll explore why the feeling of not being seen cuts so deeply, what it reveals about our emotional conditioning, and how Stoic philosophy can guide us toward a stronger, more centered life, where being seen is no longer a desperate need, but a natural result of self-alignment. If you've ever felt ignored, misunderstood, or diminished by those you needed the most, this video is for you. The pain of never being truly seen might just become the seed of your inner strength. Part 1. When even those closest to you can't see you. There are pains that scream without a sound, and perhaps the most profound of them all is the one we carry when we are surrounded by people, and yet remain invisible. Not physically, but emotionally. It's the kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with not being truly recognized. Have you ever felt that? That those around you only see a distorted version of you, a superficial caricature shaped by their own expectations, projections, or convenience, but never your real self? Often this feeling begins at home, with parents who only see the child they wanted you to be, with friends who value what you give, but not who you are, with partners who treat you as a role to be fulfilled, not a soul to be understood. And the most devastating part is that even when you try to show who you really are, even when you open up, even when you offer your truth with vulnerability, what comes back is silence, judgment, or indifference. The pain of never being truly seen is excruciating because it strikes at one of our deepest human needs, the need to belong. We are social beings, no doubt. But Stoic philosophy reminds us, with sharp clarity, that depending on others to define us is the fastest road to emotional slavery. Epictetus once said, "If someone misjudges you, that's their problem. But how do you stay untouched when the one misjudging you is the very person you wished would understand you?" Stoicism doesn't ask us to become cold. It invites us to become lucid. And lucidity here means realizing that something is more valuable than being understood, being whole. Your integrity is what you know about yourself, even when no one else sees it, even when people label you, ignore you, reduce you, even when your kindness is mistaken for weakness, even when your depth is dismissed as too much, you still are who you are. And that, in Stoic terms, is real freedom. Living in alignment with your rational nature, your upright conscience, your chosen values, without being defined by others' opinions. But that doesn't mean the pain vanishes. In fact, it may intensify the moment you wake up to the truth. When you finally realize that for years, you've been hoping to be seen by emotionally blind people. That you were never the problem. You just kept turning to the wrong eyes, asking for recognition they could never give. That moment hurts. But it's also where true Stoic empowerment begins. Because once you truly see yourself, even without applause, without approval, without a stage, you start to break free. Your presence no longer depends on being reflected in someone else's gaze. It begins to root itself in your own inner clarity. You discover that there's immense power in being who you are, even when no one notices, and that the pain of never being seen might actually be proof that you were always too deep for a distracted world. Part 2. The illusion of being recognized. Most of us grow up believing that if we're good enough, kind enough, capable enough, we will eventually be recognized. It's an unspoken promise woven into our early years. Be obedient, and you'll be loved. Get good grades, and you'll be valued. Be helpful, and you'll be seen. Without realizing it, we begin to shape our behavior around an invisible goal, to be truly seen, not just noticed, but deeply recognized. What we crave is for someone to look at us and say, "I get you. I see who you really are." That longing lives in even the most guarded hearts. But Stoicism offers us a reality check, one that can be painful at first, but freeing in the long run. Recognition, as we imagine it, is often an illusion, because it depends on variables beyond our control: the other person's awareness, emotional capacity, life experiences, and blind spots. No matter how much you give, no matter how much you try to be clear, honest, and open, you may still be misunderstood, and that's not your fault. Epictetus warned us not to hang our sense of worth on someone else's opinion, because the moment we do, we become their prisoner. And that's exactly what happens when we live for recognition. We hand over our identity to the world and ask it to validate us. Even worse, we begin to shapeshift, to edit ourselves in the hope of being accepted. We shrink, we mute ourselves, we overcompensate, all for the illusion that finally, someone will truly see us. But here's the tragedy. The more we contort ourselves to be recognized, the more we disappear. Not just from others, but from ourselves. The painful irony is this: in trying to be seen by others, we become invisible to ourselves. We lose touch with our essence. We forget what we believe, what we value, what we feel, because we've outsourced all of that to external approval. And when we finally stop and look around, we realize that the recognition we've been chasing never came, and we're no longer sure who we are without it. That's where Stoicism turns the tables. Instead of asking, "Why don't they see me?" the Stoic asks, "Why do I need so badly to be seen?" That's the beginning of emotional clarity, because the compulsive need for recognition is often a symptom of inner neglect. When we don't acknowledge ourselves, we begin to beg for acknowledgement in the eyes of others. But when we cultivate the Stoic practice of self-perception, one rooted in reason, virtue, and upright judgment, something inside us changes. We stop needing external mirrors to prove we exist. You can still be kind, even if your kindness is seen as weakness. You can still be thoughtful, even if they call you too sensitive. You can still be strong, even if they label you cold. Because when you live according to virtue, you don't need witnesses. Your inner coherence becomes your recognition, and it's the only kind that matters. The illusion of being recognized falls apart the moment you realize how deeply self-centered the world is. People are too distracted, too wounded, too absorbed in their own filters to truly see you. But instead of resenting that, what if you used it to free yourself? Because here's the truth: you don't need to be understood to be real. You don't need to be seen to exist. You don't need validation to be valid. Your alignment, your honesty with yourself, is your foundation. And once you reclaim that, no distorted perception has the power to make you vanish. Part 3. Do you see yourself? After years, maybe a lifetime of trying to be seen by the world, a deeper and more urgent question begins to emerge. Do you see yourself? Because perhaps the deepest pain isn't just that others failed to recognize us, but that somewhere along the way, we stopped recognizing ourselves. And that's one of the most confronting questions Stoicism offers us. Instead of waiting for external validation, what if we turned inward and asked, how well do I know and value myself? The answer is often complicated. Many of us are strangers to our own essence. We repeat habits we don't fully understand. We react in ways that confuse us. We play roles we didn't consciously choose. Over time, we become actors in a life that doesn't feel fully ours, performing a version of ourselves shaped by expectation, survival, or cultural conditioning. And even when someone offers praise, it rarely feels authentic. Because deep down, we know it wasn't the real us being recognized. It was the mask. Epictetus taught that we must know who we are and what we want from life, not because someone told us, but because we've examined ourselves with honesty. That kind of examination requires silence, space, detachment from the noise of the world. The Stoic doesn't live for applause. They live for integrity, for the alignment between thought, emotion, and action. And that demands self-awareness, the courage to face what's within without flinching. But many of us were never taught how to look inward. In fact, we were often taught to avoid it, to suppress feelings, to hide vulnerability, to fit in at any cost. We learned to amputate parts of ourselves just to be accepted. And the price? A growing sense of internal distance. We became more likable to others, but less visible to ourselves. That's why the Stoic practice of self-perception is so radical. It doesn't ask you to fix yourself. It asks you to finally see yourself, without distortion, without exaggeration, without shame. To see your patterns, your fears, your wisdom, your contradictions, and hold space for all of it without flinching. This is the first step toward freedom, reclaiming your ability to know who you are, even when the world doesn't reflect it back to you. Because when you start seeing yourself clearly, something fundamental shifts. You stop apologizing for your presence. You stop shrinking for other people's comfort. You stop compromising your truth just to feel less alone. You realize that your value isn't a product of being understood. It's anchored in your own self-knowledge. Of course, this clarity takes time. Self-perception is not something we inherit. It's something we build. Through solitude, through reflection, through the daily decision to align with truth rather than performance, and through the courage to hold your ground even when no one else affirms it. When you see yourself with clarity, you stop needing to chase love, bend to be accepted, or wear masks just to feel safe. You can simply be, even if that means being misunderstood. Because your strength now comes from something the world can't offer: emotional sovereignty. You've reclaimed your inner authority, and in Stoic terms, that's what makes you truly free. Part 4. The Stoic root of emotional freedom. In today's world, everyone seems to be chasing emotional freedom. People want to feel lighter, more confident, less dependent on others. But most of the advice out there barely scratches the surface. It tells us to let go, to just stop caring, to focus on ourselves, without really showing how to do that in a grounded, lasting way. That's where Stoicism takes a radically different approach. It doesn't offer shallow optimism or spiritual bypassing. It leads us to the very root of what it means to be emotionally free. And that root is self-mastery. Real freedom, according to the Stoics, is not about doing whatever we want. It's about no longer being a slave to what we can't control. And what we can't control includes the way others see us, how they talk about us, whether they recognize us or not. If your sense of self is built on whether or not others get you, then you've given them the reins to your inner world. And that's not freedom. It's captivity in disguise. Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations wrote, "The source of good is within yourself, and it will keep flowing if you just keep digging." That's the essence of emotional liberation in Stoic philosophy. The realization that your worth, your clarity, your peace, all of it begins within. When you understand this, something powerful shifts. You stop outsourcing your emotional reality to the reactions of others. You stop waiting for recognition. You stop begging to be seen. And you begin, finally, to be, fully, quietly, unwaveringly. At this point, the pain of not being seen may still exist, but it no longer owns you. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it might linger. But when you stop letting it dictate your value or decisions, it starts to lose its grip. This is where maturity sets in. Not the kind that numbs or detaches, but the kind that sees clearly and still chooses not to be ruled by what doesn't matter. And here lies a paradox. The more you seek recognition, the more fragile you become. But the more you release the need to be seen, the more grounded you become. Authenticity doesn't scream. It doesn't chase attention. It simply is, steady, calm, and undisturbed. And yes, it might be invisible to many, but it will never be invisible to you. Stoicism teaches us the difference between pain and suffering. The pain of not being recognized is real. It's part of being human. But the suffering, that comes from resistance, from believing that things should be different, from expecting others to offer what they've never developed within themselves. And that expectation is what creates the deepest wounds. But once you let go of that hope, not in bitterness, but in clarity, you begin to reclaim your power. You feel the hurt and still remain whole. You walk through rejection and still hold your ground. You face indifference and still choose to be yourself. That's emotional freedom. That's the quiet power of a Stoic soul. This kind of freedom isn't achieved overnight. It's built, decision by decision. Each time you choose to stay aligned with your values rather than react to someone else's blindness, you grow. Each time you act from clarity instead of insecurity, you deepen. Each time you stand tall in your own truth, whether or not anyone claps, you become freer. And the day will come when you realize you no longer need to be seen to feel real. You don't need permission to shine. You don't need agreement to move forward. Your worth is rooted in something far stronger than attention. It's rooted in awareness. And that awareness, cultivated by reason, virtue, and honesty, becomes the unshakable core of your being. Part 5. When invisibility becomes a shield. Over time, the pain of not being seen can morph into something even more dangerous, a shield. At first, this invisibility feels like a wound, raw, aching, and disorienting. But eventually we start to wrap that wound in layers of silence, detachment, and self-protection. We stop trying to be understood. We stop showing up fully. And slowly, almost without noticing, we begin to believe that being invisible is safer than being misunderstood one more time. The shield of invisibility becomes a defense mechanism, a way to avoid further rejection. You start to filter your feelings, dilute your truth, and calculate your presence so carefully that you're no longer living, you're managing. You tell yourself it's better this way, that you're in control, that nothing can hurt you anymore. But in reality, you're no longer living from the core of who you are. You're surviving, armored, guarded, distant. Stoicism recognizes this human impulse to protect the self. It doesn't shame it. It understands that defense mechanisms arise when vulnerability has been punished one too many times. But Stoicism also warns against turning those defenses into permanent walls. Because the very shield that once kept you safe can, over time, become the prison that keeps you from growing, connecting, and healing. Seneca wrote that, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." And when we imagine that exposure will always equal pain, we begin to numb ourselves. We cut off not just the potential for hurt, but also the potential for joy, intimacy, and presence. We lose the richness of being alive because we're so busy being unseen. And worst of all, we begin to question whether our sensitivity, our intensity, our truth, were ever valid to begin with. That's why the Stoic path doesn't ask you to break your shield forcefully. It invites you to examine it, to understand what built it, to honor how it served you. And then, when the time is right, to begin setting it down, not all at once, and not for everyone, but moment by moment, in safe spaces, with discerning clarity. True emotional freedom isn't about becoming invulnerable. It's about no longer needing the world's validation to feel whole. And part of that journey is reclaiming your visibility, not for recognition, but for alignment. To live in a way that is honest, consistent, and grounded, even if no one notices, even if no one applauds. Because here's the paradox. The more you hide to avoid pain, the more disconnected you become. From others, from life, from yourself. You start to fade. And the scariest part? You begin to believe that fading is normal, that shrinking is survival, that quieting your truth is wisdom. But it's not. It's fear wearing the mask of control. And so, The Stoic teaches us to meet that fear with reason, to ask, is this shield still protecting me, or is it now limiting me? Is my invisibility still a choice, or has it become a habit I no longer question? The moment you start asking those questions, you open the door to transformation. You remember that you were never too much, that your depth is not a flaw, that your longing to be seen was never weakness. It was your humanity reaching for connection. And even if that connection was denied, you're still here, still whole, still worthy. You don't need to shatter your shield, just loosen it. Just breathe into the spaces where your real self still exists. Just allow the possibility that you no longer have to hide in order to feel safe. Because the truth is, your safety, your peace, your power, they don't come from being invisible. They come from being honest. With yourself. First and always. Part 6. Their judgment doesn't define you. One of the most corrosive lies we internalize is the belief that how others see us determines who we are. We start living through borrowed eyes, measuring our worth by someone else's standards, seeking affirmation from people who may never understand us. And so, we begin to filter our words, censor our feelings, and shrink our truth, all in the hope that we might finally be seen the right way. But here's what Stoicism teaches, with unwavering clarity. Other people's judgments are not your identity. Think about how often you've remained silent to avoid being judged. How many times you've held back because you feared being labeled as too sensitive, too intense, too different. How many parts of you were hidden, not because they were wrong, but because you sensed they wouldn't be welcomed. And slowly the narrative forms. If they think this about me, maybe it's true. But Epictetus was relentless on this point. What people think is their business, not yours. You do not control the contents of someone else's mind. Their projections are not your reflection. Their misunderstandings are not your responsibility. Their labels don't belong to you unless you choose to carry them. The problem isn't that people judge. It's that we start living as if those judgments are accurate. We contort ourselves to avoid conflict, rejection, or discomfort. We let their limited view shape our reality. But the moment you allow external opinions to shape your internal world, you become a prisoner of perceptions you never agreed to. Seneca wrote, "He who seeks to please everyone pleases no one, least of all himself." And that's the heart of the matter. Trying to manage how others see you is an endless, exhausting task. You become hypervigilant. Every action, every word, every emotion gets filtered through the question, how will they take this? But Stoicism asks a different question. Is this in alignment with virtue? That's the only standard that matters. Not approval, not applause, not recognition, just virtue, just truth. Because here's the deeper truth. The people who judge you harshly are often reacting to their own discomfort. Your clarity threatens their confusion. Your depth mirrors their superficiality. Your boundaries challenge their control. And so they distort you, not because you're wrong, but because they're unsettled. And if you don't understand that, you'll spend your life trying to correct a reflection in a broken mirror. You do not owe the world a version of yourself that is more palatable, more digestible, more convenient. You owe yourself honesty. You owe yourself congruence. And the moment you stop trying to be seen the right way, you start to be real. Not for them, but for you. Yes, people will continue to misinterpret you. That's inevitable. But you don't have to internalize their confusion. You don't have to shrink just because someone else lacks the capacity to understand your full size. You can honor your truth without their permission. You can walk your path even if no one claps. You can choose freedom, not from judgment, but from believing it defines you. That's the Stoic power, to live with unwavering self-awareness, even in the face of misunderstanding. To maintain dignity without needing defense. To act from principle, not from fear. To recognize that your value isn't up for public vote. It never was. So the next time someone sees you through a distorted lens, remember, their lens is not your responsibility. And your clarity, the way you see yourself, is more powerful than any judgment cast from the outside. Stand in that clarity. Live from that center. Because in the end, it's not their view of you that matters. It's yours. Part 7. You were never the problem. One of the most painful legacies we carry is the quiet belief that maybe it was all our fault. That if we had just been easier to love, less complicated, more agreeable, someone would have stayed. Someone would have understood. And so, we turn that rejection inward. We blame ourselves for not being seen, and we wear that blame like a scar. But here's what Stoicism helps us see clearly. You were never the problem. What made you feel invisible wasn't who you are. It was the limited vision of those around you. It wasn't your emotional depth, but their inability to witness it. Yet because these wounds are often formed early, we internalize the rejection. We confuse their blindness with our worth. And that misunderstanding grows into silence, self-doubt, and abandonment of our own truth. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that what's irrational is also unnatural. And there is nothing more irrational than measuring your identity by someone else's inability to understand you. It goes against reason, and it robs you of your integrity. But once you realize this, deeply, something shifts. You begin to grieve, not your identity, but all the time you spent chasing what should have been freely given. You start to shed the masks you wore to feel included. And underneath them, you find something that was never broken. Your real self. The Stoic path doesn't ask you to ignore the pain. It teaches you to see it with precision, to recognize it without letting it define you, to stop waiting for closure from those who never saw you. You begin to move differently, not in search of attention, but in service to your own clarity. Emotional sovereignty begins here. When you understand that the rejection wasn't about your truth, it was about their discomfort. People often reject what they don't understand. They label what they can't hold. You weren't too much. You were the mirror. And your reflection revealed parts of them they were not ready to face. You don't need to keep explaining yourself. You don't need to perform your pain hoping someone finally gets it. Because now, you get it. You see you. And that's more powerful than any outside validation. From this place, you begin to rebuild. You seek out people and spaces that meet you with presence. You release the need to be universally accepted. You stop oversharing in places that cannot hold your truth. You begin choosing connection with discernment, not desperation. When you finally know, calmly, firmly, that you were never the problem, everything softens. You breathe differently. You move through the world without carrying the weight of others' blindness. You come back home to yourself. And from there, you don't just survive. You lead, you love, you rise. Part 8. You don't need to be seen to be real. We live in a world obsessed with being seen. A world where value often feels tied to visibility, to likes, followers, comments, reactions. Where the absence of recognition is mistaken for the absence of meaning. And somewhere along the way, we start believing that if no one sees us, maybe we don't matter. Maybe we're not real. But Stoicism brings us back to a radical truth. You don't need to be seen to be whole. Your worth isn't dependent on someone else's awareness. Your truth doesn't lose weight just because others can't perceive it. What's real about you, your values, your intentions, your integrity, exists regardless of who notices. It exists in your silence, in your private victories, in the invisible choices you make every day to stay aligned with your principles. That's the kind of strength Stoicism teaches us to cultivate, one that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but endures. Because when you build your sense of self on something as fleeting as recognition, you become vulnerable to every glance, every opinion, every wave of indifference. But when you root yourself in your own clarity, your own reason, your own virtue, you no longer need anyone's permission to exist fully. Maybe you've spent years trying to be noticed. Maybe you adjusted your voice, your behavior, your essence, just to feel a little more visible. Maybe you shrank, smiled, nodded, agreed, just to avoid the sting of being ignored. But there comes a moment when you realize your value was never missing. It was only misdirected, handed to those who didn't know how to hold it. You are not less real because someone couldn't see you. You are not less worthy because someone couldn't understand you. You are not less whole because someone refused to meet you where you are. The lack is not in you. It's in their ability to perceive. The most powerful forces in nature are invisible: gravity, breath, thought, spirit. Your presence can be one of them. Quiet, strong, steady. Not because someone else said so, but because you said so. Because you chose to be, fully and freely, without waiting for confirmation. The pain of not being seen may still echo, but you no longer need to carry it like a wound. You can acknowledge it, honor it, and let it go. You can choose to live in full alignment with your truth, even if no one else applauds. Because you're not here to be validated. You're here to be real. And as you strengthen that clarity inside you, a new question will arise. Not about how others see you, but about how you protect your growth when they keep looking at who you used to be. That's what we'll explore next. If this message reached something inside you, leave a comment and share your experience. It might help someone else feel less alone. And if you're walking this Stoic path too, subscribe to the channel and join me each week for more. See you in the next video.